Did you know that there's a bunch of other Western games besides Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2? And in this video we will be covering one of them. Good day and welcome back to Retro Games in Rally English. My name is Juho Kuorikoski, I'm a Finnish journalist and a non-fiction author, and I'm here to talk about old games in my very Finnish English. Today we will be talking about Freddy Pharkas, the Frontier Pharmacist, and try saying that 10 times in a row. I admit, this game is no masterpiece, but it has a special place in my heart, for it is a first point-and-click Sierra game that I have ever played. Back in the day, this felt almost as good as Secret of Monkey Island. I've always been more of a LucasArts fan rather than Sierra, but this original gangster of adventure game has an extensive library of excellent titles. When we are talking about adventure games, it's very hard not to mention Sierra. So, it's time to dust off the spiderwebs, jump on a proverbial horse and see what this pixelated prairie has to offer. I'm going to give it a fair trial, followed by a first-class hanging.
Freddy Pharkas was released by Sierra in 1993. The game is a humorous point-and-click game set in the Wild West. The main character of the game is a pharmacist in the town of Coarsegold, California. On an interesting side note, this is the same place where Sierra's headquarters were located in 1993. Previously, Freddy was a prominent gunslinger who had to switch jobs when Kenny the Kid, an obvious reference to Sierra founder Ken Williams and Billy the Kid, shot off one of his ears. Now Freddy works as a pharmacist, but there's something fishy going on. Someone is buying off the property and scaring people off at Coarsegold. The sheriff is of course a lazy douchebag, so it's up to Freddy to take matters into his own hands and figure out what's happening. The original floppy version was released in 1993 and it was followed by a full-talkie CD-ROM edition a year later. Usually the enhanced CD versions are superior when compared to the ones on floppies, but in Freddy Pharkas things are a bit different. There's loads of content missing from the CD version, and many, me included, consider the floppy version the best way to experience the game.
Freddy Pharkas is a solid point-and-click adventure game, and in regards of gameplay, the title offers few surprises. It achieves exactly what it sets out to do, a few laughs in a western environment. The general look and feel of the game make it quite obvious that the folks at Sierra were aiming at the same target as were the developers of LucasArts. The game looks and feels quite similar as does the Secret of Monkey Island.
The game is divided into 4 acts. The first part is somewhat of a tutorial, where the main goal is to get acquainted with the world. As a pharmacist, Freddy has to manufacture different types of medicine from his collection of ingredients. This is somewhat tedious, as you need to be very precise when mixing the stuff together. And on top of that, most of the materials are hard to read and pronounce. After the pharmaceutical shenanigans, Freddy has to save the town from multiple threats, such as horses that fart poisonous gas and ravaged pack of snails. Defeating the snails will result in a rather funny Lemming-style joke. When the town is safe, next job is to dress up and equip yourself as a pistolero, and then it's finally time to do some actual western stuff. Too bad that the game ends almost as soon as it starts. The first half of the game feels mostly like a filler that in some regard sets the mood, but acts more like a break so that the developers could ramp up length for the game. The city of Coarsegold is quite cramped, as there's no more than 20 screens to explore. In my opinion, this is a good thing, as the adventure stays compact and you don't need to wander around figuring out what to do next. As a humor adventure, Freddy Pharkas has endured time surprisingly well, which can't be said about the Leisure Suit Larry games that the development lead Al Lowe is more familiar. The game makes fun of plethora of western cliches and does it so well that the majority of jokes remain funny even today. For example, a wild cattle herd is a common threat in many westerns. Freddy has to deal with this kind of situation too, but the herd consists of snails rather than raging bulls and maniacal cows. Instead of mere minutes or hours, Freddy has over a week to solve the crisis. And while we are on the subject of cattle, there's a lot of jokes about sheep. There's a lamb working at a brothel, so the tone of these jokes is somewhat self-explanatory. While the story and humor work well, same can't be said about the puzzles. Luckily, there's only a few occasions that result in sudden deaths, which are almost a trademark of Sierra's adventure games. The biggest issue this time is structure, which means that in certain portions of the game you have to do exactly the right things in exactly the right order. Otherwise the game becomes unbeatable. Then it's time to load a save file and try again. Hopefully you have saved and in multiple slots, if not, it's too bad. Luckily the structural problems affect only the second act, rest of the game relies more on traditional puzzle solving where logic dictates the pace of the game, at least most of the time. In true fashion of the 90s adventure games, there are some bizarre and very cryptic puzzles that require mental capabilities of a Vulcan or a walkthrough. In all honesty, I don't understand how I was able to complete the game in the 90s without the help of the internet.
While the gameplay may have not aged that well, that really doesn't matter, because story and especially the humor are the bread and butter of this game. Freddy Pharkas was and still is well worth the effort of clicking through to the end credits. The story behind the game is also quite interesting. Freddy Pharkas meant different things to the two game developers working with the title.
Established in 1979, Online Systems, later known as Sierra Online, was a software powerhouse that dominated the PC game markets in the 1980s and 90s. During its peak, Sierra's cut of the software sales in general was 28%. In every dollar spent on software, Sierra got 28 cents. Founded by Roberta and Ken Williams, Sierra became famous by its extensive library of adventure games. The best-known franchises were King's Quest, Space Quest, Police Quest, and Leisure Suit Larry. The last one mentioned was a brainchild of Al Lowe, a musician and a teacher who later got involved with programming and game development. Leisure Suit Larry was a series of games where the titular character was looking for love, or at least some female companionship. These somewhat naughty adventure games were very popular, but at the early 90s Lowe wanted to do something different. As a fan of Western movies, he decided to use the Old West as a setting for a different type of adventure game. He wanted to adapt Blazing Saddles from Silver Screen to an adventure game. At Sierra, the game developers trained through a mentoring system, where an experienced game developer took a rookie under his or her wings. The senior developers were responsible for the project, but all the work was done by the junior. For example, Roberta Williams trained Jane Jensen in King's Quest VI, and later Jensen made her critically acclaimed Gabriel Knight trilogy. For Freddy Pharkas, Al Lowe teamed up with Josh Mandel. Although Lowe was technically in charge of the project, Mandel is actually the one who wrote the general outlines of the story and majority of jokes. The idea for the game was pitched to Ken Williams by Lowe in early 90s. Lowe mixed up some words when he was describing main character's career. He meant to say farmer, but ended up saying pharmacist. That slip got the wheel spinning and the game went to production. Josh Mandel has stated that Freddy Pharkas has been the pivotal moment in his career as game developer. He was very passionate of the project, and sometimes this resulted in small clashes when visions collided. Mandel was very adamant about the text with the bouncing dots that ran on the screen over the displayed text when ballads were performed. Programmers said that it couldn't be done because the ball had to bounce in sync with the music. Mandel didn't budge, and eventually he got what he wanted. While Mandel wrote the script, most of the story and dialogue, he also directed and produced. He managed everything but had to approve his decisions with Lowe. There were a few disagreements, and usually Lowe had the last word. On few occasions Lowe challenged Mandel just to see if he could hold his ground. When Freddy Pharkas was released in 1993, the game garnered favorable reviews, but the sales weren't stellar. However, the game sold so well that Sierra decided to make a CD version of the game with a recorded dialogue. There are considerable differences between the floppy and CD version. In many regards, the floppy version is superior when compared to the CD edition, where some of the content was cut out from the game. Josh Mandel was making Space Quest VI at the time when the production of Freddy Pharkas' CD version started, so he couldn't produce or direct the project. Instead, Al Lowe was tasked to take care of the enhanced edition. Lowe had to cast the voice actors and record the dialogue. But the game was so text-heavy, Lowe got tired and axed about 15% of the text, majority of inventory text, for example. Because of this, many of the jokes are missing, but this impacted also on the gameplay. The dialogue written for the inventory items contained a lot of hints and clues for the puzzles. It's quite unusual when a floppy version is considered to be superior when compared to the enhanced CD-ROM editions of a game, but in this case the non-talkie is an obvious choice. The dub dialogue has lost its charm, and it's a lot more fun to imagine what the characters sound like instead of them actually speaking. For you millennials, this must be confusing, but there actually was a time when we had to read the text from the screen instead of someone talking. Although Freddy Pharkas sold 6 figures according to Al Lowe, at the time this was considered a failure. The original floppy version sold around 150,000 copies in the first year, and the combined lifetime sales of floppy and CD-ROM versions were around 500,000 units in 3 years. While the sales would have warranted a sequel, it took a very long time for Freddy Pharkas to rise to these numbers. Mandel and Lowe had moved on to other projects, so the preliminary plans were first trashed, and then a sequel just fell through the cracks.
In conclusion, Freddy Pharkas is competent and a funny point-and-click adventure game. Sure, the game has its own annoyances, but if you can stomach these, the game is right on par with other modern adventure games. The game is available for purchase at GOG.com, and as usual, the title works like a charm on modern computers. Apparently GOG lost at a poker table because the version they are selling is the inferior CD edition. But that's life, you can't win all the time. As always, the race was hard and tire was bad. Until next time, Kuorikoski out.